Hi, welcome to WikiTree's 2024 Symposium, Day 2. My name is Sandy Paddock, and I'm with Ancestry Roads. I'm going to kick off today with my program called More Than Moonshine, the Food Cultures of Appalachia. Now, if you are here and you're thinking, why am I watching a show about Appalachia? I don't know where Appalachia is, or maybe you do know where Appalachia is, and you're thinking, I don't have any ancestors from Appalachia. What is going on here? Or maybe you're just curious about the food. That's always something that we Appalachians talk about. But I'm going to show you in the next hour how you are probably more related to Appalachians, or should I say, we are probably more related to you than you might realize. I've got a very short video to show you, so settle in, get your biscuit ready. Yep, I got it. And get your sweet tea ready. And let's go ahead and dig into this hour. And first, as I mentioned, I'm going to kick it off with a short video. As you watch the video, I would like each of you to sit and think about the food that you eat, the food culture in your family. What is important to you when you have a special event or a holiday? What foods do you crave? Because at the end of this hour, we're going to find out that we have more in common than we don't. So enjoy. I'll see you on the other side. Many things can be said about Appalachia, but if there's one thing that is true, our foods and our culture are definitely tied to each other. Appalachia was populated by many different cultures, including Native Americans, Europeans, and African Americans. Have you ever thought about why you eat the foods that you do? Do they have a cultural reference? Do they have a historical reference within your family? Did your ancestors bring a certain recipe over from the old world? Or was it something that they created out of necessity? As you think about these foods that you ate when you were younger or even today, was there a way that they were prepared? Were they prepared maybe something was sliced or instead of diced? Maybe something was slivered or maybe something was chunked? Was there a particular utensil or tool that was used that could give you clues on what your heritage is and what your ancestors used? As well as think about how foods were cooked. Sometimes they were fried, sometimes they were boiled. Maybe they were over a campfire. Foods have historical references. Food is a fascinating lens through which we can explore our history, our culture, our societal changes. In thinking about bread, almost every culture around the world eats bread, but almost every culture has different ways of preparing it or different ways of using it in their meals. Let's take two examples, one being pasta, the other one being tea. Let's take it from their origins, and then I will show you how it transforms throughout the world and how it ends up in Appalachia. Let's think about pasta, often associated with Italian cuisine, but pasta has its origins in ancient China. In Appalachia, buttered noodles is a comfort food. Almost every Appalachian knows that buttered egg noodles when you're sick is the best cure. Our other example is tea. Cultivation of tea leaves began in ancient China and mostly for medicinal purposes, but now it's become a global beverage. When I think of tea, oddly enough, I think of high tea, maybe in Ireland or England, but in Appalachia, sweet tea is always at the dinner table. Those are just two examples of foods with historical significance that is so vast. Our historical references are often clues on our own ancestors and where they settled or even who their neighbors were. If you were in southern Appalachia, chances are you probably ate cornbread where corn was more prevalent and grown. If you were from northern Appalachia, chances are you had biscuits where flour was more prevalent. Also, the way that you ate these types of foods and the way they were prepared or the spices that were included were heavily influenced by the cultures that came with these ancestors, but also their neighbors. If you were Scottish living next to a German family, then your cultures ended up mixing and you're creating a new food culture. The next time that you prepare a dish, stop and think about the ingredients you're using. How are you preparing it? How are you cooking the meal? How does this relate to your heritage? Now think about some of your favorite foods. I love pizza. I can eat pizza every day of the week. Is that tied to my heritage? No, I have absolutely zero Italian DNA. But what it is tied to is part of the area that I grew up that had a large contingent of Italian immigrants. So, what truly satisfies your cravings? Is it something that you grew up with and inherited from your heritage, from your ancestors? Or is it something that you grew up with because of the culture in your neighborhood? And yes, Appalachia is known for its moonshine. Moonshine is a fascinating, complex topic with a rich history that's entwined with Appalachia and the development of Appalachia. It's a significant part of American history as well. It represents a blend of a want and desire, along with rebellion and cultural identity, which Appalachia has taken on. But Appalachia is so much more than moonshine. It is an enduring legacy of our Appalachian culture and our cuisine that is tied together, that lies in such a deep connection to our region's history, to the many immigrants who came and settled the hills, the mountains, the hollers of Appalachia. It is also the enduring legacy of changing with the times and adapting where needed for different ingredients, different neighbors, different cultures coming into Appalachia. I think you'll find that Appalachian food really is a blending of global cultures and foods. I hope I made you a little hungry, a little curious, and ready to dive into what is Appalachian food cultures, the history, and the heritage. But first, let's figure out and learn where Appalachia truly is.
Although Appalachia lacks definite physiographical or topographical boundaries, with the area being defined in 1965 based on economic need versus cultural parameters, it is generally accepted that there are 5 regions: northern, north-central, central, south-central, and southern. The region is not the same as the mountain range. These are 2 different topics. Appalachia is a 205,000 square mile region that follows the spine of the Appalachian Mountains from southern New York to northern Mississippi. It includes all of West Virginia and parts of 12 other states: Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. About 23.6 million people live in the 423 counties of the Appalachian region, with 42% considered rural. The 6 physiographic provinces that in whole or in part are commonly treated as components of Appalachia are Appalachian Plateau, Allegheny Mountains, Ridge and Valley Appalachians, Great Appalachian Valley, Blue Ridge Mountains, and Piedmont. Welcome to Appalachia.
I hope that gave you guys a little bit of taste of what's to come in the presentation today. And if you notice, there's a lot of different foods, a lot of different cultures that blend in. But before I begin on specifically talking about Appalachia, I would love to hear the feedback from you. I did ask in the video one really, really great question. And for some of us, it's real early. Some of us, it's dinner time. So the question is, what satisfies your craving? And if you guys would list either your favorite food or what is it that you constantly crave, or if it's somebody says, let's go out to dinner, you're going to go for that particular cuisine. The reason why I'm asking you this is to show that Appalachian food really is global. And we do have a lot of commonality along with that. Let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. And I wanna before I go too much further, I wanna thank WikiTree for allowing me to present this. This is a pretty narrow topic, I understand that, but I promise you at the end of this hour, I'm gonna make all of you Appalachians. If you know me around WikiTree, one of my favorite things to do is the rock program where I try to show that everybody that's getting rocked, WARK, random acts of WikiTree kindness, that I can prove that your family somehow your CC7 is gonna go through Appalachia. So, again, I wanna thank WikiTree for allowing me to present this very culinary program that we've got going on today. And let me talk to you a little bit about my Appalachia. So, the experiences that I'm going to talk about are some general experience, some historical, but I'm going to throw in a lot of what my Appalachia is. So, before I go any further, I think it's important for you to know what is my Appalachia. So, for Sandy, my Appalachia is going to be pretty much solely based in West Virginia. And West Virginia is the only state that is entirely in Appalachia. My family comes pretty much smack dab from the middle. If you happen to watch my WikiTree symposium presentation last year, I had my family on and we talked about the Hillbilly Highway, how we had to leave the West Virginia hills and the hollers to go seek better jobs. There were no jobs and families were hungry. They needed income, and my grandparents, unfortunately, had lost their farm. They couldn't afford to keep the farm, and it was sold at auction. That was something I talked about with Hillbilly Highway last year for WikiTree. So this year, we're gonna take it to the next step and talk about the food and the culture and the heritage. So even though my family left West Virginia and traveled along the Hillbilly Highway, our strong food cultures remain. Even to this day, I teach my son the food cultures that I learned from my mother and from my grandmother. And a little bit later on, we're actually going to hear from my mother. So this will be an interesting event. I currently am sitting in southern Appalachia, and I will invite you all to join me as we go on this adventure. As we look at this map, this is a map that was in the video, and I just want to point out a couple different things that maybe got a little bit too quickly in the video. The Appalachians are different from the Appalachian Mountains. So the Appalachians is a group of people. The Appalachian Mountains is an actual mountain range. When I talk about Appalachia, I'm talking about the areas that are listed in this particular map. This is a map consisting from about over 430 counties in the United States. This is designated by our United States government. We do have a government agency called the Appalachian Regional Commission, and they're the ones that help bring more income, more jobs, and more food production into Appalachia. So this is kind of our source that we used for the Appalachia Project on WikiTree. But I can tell you, as a professional genealogist for over 20 years, this is the pretty much the source that I've used as well. The one question that I get more than not is, could you please include my county in Appalachia? And I don't have the powers of the government, but if you feel like you're an Appalachian and you want to identify as that, I have zero problem with that. We love that. So it is a geographical region in the eastern United States. It's very diverse, and it's important to understand this diversity of the geography because the mountains, the valleys, and the rivers are really our food source. Those three are how we would, when we first populated Appalachia, sustain ourselves with food from the mountains, the valleys, and the rivers. The other thing is we are very, very rich in music, storytelling, and food. Again, if you watched my WikiTree symposium presentation 2 years ago, we had a musician on, and we talked about the Appalachian music and the mountain culture of music and what it does and what it provides to you. I can guarantee you that if you're anywhere in Appalachia and you see a musical event or a random jam of music, if there's storytelling contests, which there are, there's food involved. If you're an Appalachian, there's going to be food involved. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the food waste because I think this is important to understand this, but it's also you have food waste wherever you're sitting as well. So keep that in mind as we go through this. The foodways are Appalachian foodways are really a unique blend. They're traditions, they're influenced by our region's history, again, our geography and our culture. Those 2 really go hand in hand, and why is that? Because when Appalachia was populated, it was after pretty much the colonial times, and people were moving further out west, and they were getting to the mountains. One of the things that I love to say about Kentucky is so many people had to go through Kentucky to get west, and so many people stayed in Kentucky. They didn't go further. So, it's basically our geography and our culture really do go hand in hand with that. Appalachians have always been resourceful. They've always utilized the local ingredients. Preserving food is a very big thing in Appalachia. I can tell you as a young child, my grandmother had a cellar, and the amount of food she would can, and we call it put up, the amount of food that she would put up was huge, and it would last all winter, barely. And I would always think as a young kid, as she's canning, how are we ever going to eat all this food? And sure enough, they did. And the reason why they canned is because these were not individuals that would normally go to a grocery store and buy typical tin can food. Instead, they would have gardens, and they didn't want the food to go to waste from the gardens. So what would they do? They would can it and preserve it and then keep it and eat it all winter long until they planted their garden and the garden came back up again. So the cuisine really does reflect the seasons with the dishes that are growing locally. You didn't really go far as an Appalachian. You found what you needed usually in your back area, your backwoods, your backyard, or your neighbor's area. That was pretty much the distance that you went. It's changed now, but I can tell you, even as a kid, pretty much self-sustaining, you didn't go very far. Now, Appalachia food has become a new thing. And some people try to change it, and I'm okay with people changing the food and making it something different and modernizing it. But Appalachia food doesn't always need change. It is what it is. And it's kind of like your culture as well. If you think about it, if somebody came in and said, we're going to take this food that you've always ate all your life and your ancestors always ate, and this is what they brought to America, this culture and this heritage, you might like it, but it won't be the same. It'll be just slightly different. So, what are the key cultural values? And as we go through this, I want you to think about Appalachia. I want you to think about your own areas, your own location, and let's see if we can blend the 2 here. So, really, for Appalachians, as many know, if you've done any type of genealogy, and a lot of people have done the DNA, that Appalachia was heavily populated by the Scots and some of the Irish, but we like call the Scots were probably the predominant ones, and a tremendous amount of Germans. This was very early on. This was in the 1700s. This was a time when the promise of land, the promise of freedom of religion, the promise of an expansion to bring your family, create a new life for yourself. This was very enticing to a lot of people. So they came and they lived in something extremely similar to this. This is actually a cabin in smack in the middle of West Virginia. This cabin has no electricity. It has no indoor plumbing, actually has no plumbing inside, so there's the kitchen sink has no running water coming in. Anything that you wanted for water, you went to the pump house to get. If you needed to use the bathroom, well, there was one outside called an outhouse, and this particular cabin is also right up against a river, and it's the mighty Elk River. And if you're anywhere in West Virginia, you'll know the mighty Elk River because that's where food came from. It's recreation pretty much now, but trout fishing was very big. And this is how the Appalachians and my ancestors actually found their food cultures innate. The interesting thing about this is that this location is in this cabin is a tourist location. So people will actively book this cabin all year round to go to a place with no running water and no bathroom. And I can tell you it's beautiful inside, it's hand carved, this is something that my ancestors would have lived in, but I do prefer running water as I go through life. So the emphasis again for those who immigrated here is really gonna be on maintaining their traditional practices. Just because they came to America does not mean that they wanted to ignore all their heritage and their culture. And that's really important because as we look at our own family history and our own heritage, there are clues. As we said before, food has clues in it. And we're talking about the historical background that we have for Appalachia. It's really diverse. I think a lot of people will think of Appalachians as somebody who sits back, maybe drinks Mountain Dew, maybe drinks sweet tea, maybe has a biscuit here and there, and really probably thinking that there might be even poor. But our historical background is full of hardworking individuals, immigrants that came with nothing. They came and they had a dream and a goal. So, what we're seeing though is we've got the Native Americans that are already here. And then we have the African American contributions along with the European immigrant influences. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what they specifically did together and how they created this new food culture. So we have pretty much three different areas, three different heritage coming together. And guess what they're doing? They're creating a new food culture while keeping their own food culture. The soulful flavors that the African Americans brought is they're bold flavors, and they gave us the herbs, the spices, the vinegars. The, indigenous people of the Appalachians Mountains really relied heavily on seasonal ingredients, and they knew how to use the ingredients, how to plant them, and when to pick them as well. And they also developed unique techniques for preserving as well as preparing the food. So when the Europeans, came in, then we learned from them how to become an Appalachian pretty much. The British that came over, and I'll kind of say the British, the Scots, the Irish all together, you might be surprised at this, but they gave us three very, very important cultural things for Appalachia. And I would say that these three things are probably what we're known for. So the first one would be buttermilk, something sadly I have not been able to enjoy. It's not one of my favorites, I'll admit. Biscuits, and then also moonshine. So the more of the, British, Irish, and Scottish gave us the biscuits, the buttermilk, and the moonshine. One thing that always surprised me when I started out with genealogy years and years and years ago on my own family, I was always told that I was Scottish. You know, you got a name like Craig, you're probably going to be Scottish. So I always was surprised when I found such a heavy amount of German heritage in my family. And that might explain why I like bread so much, but it also might explain why I like potatoes so much, because the Germans brought different cultures and different heritage and different food into Appalachia. They brought the sausage, they brought the sauerkraut, and the baking traditions. So if you combine all these different types of cultures, think about this for a second. So I said that we're going to bring in the British, the Irish, the Scottish, the buttermilk, the biscuits, the moonshine. If you say that to anybody in the United States, they're gonna tell you, "Well, that sounds like Appalachia." And then if you start to bring in the sausage and the sauerkraut and the baking and the bread, again, biscuits, even cornbread, even sourdoughs, things like that, you're gonna blend these together, and now you've got a new food culture. And that's how it happens. If you think about where you're sitting now, how did food cultures blend to make something that your area is now defined by? And I love it that they said buttermilk goes in cornbread. We had that debate in the Appalachia channel. It was like, does the buttermilk go in the cornbread, or does the cornbread go in the buttermilk? So you'll have to let me know. So for Appalachian cuisine, what are the characteristics? Well, this is where we're going to kind of get into some specifics of what I've seen in my life as well. So pork, beef, chicken are all common meats. They're common, they're very global as well. They are most often, I would say, in Appalachia, fried. I'll just put that out there. They are pretty much fried. They are smoked and they are cured. If you're in southern Appalachia, they're probably almost always going to lean towards smoke. The funny thing, if you look at this picture in the middle, we camp as a family and we'll go camping to several campgrounds. And this is a particular campground that's right at the border of North Carolina and Georgia. There's this grocery store that has this lunch counter, and they pride themselves and they'll call themselves, "We only serve Appalachian cuisine." It's funny to me because I'm looking at a biscuit, I'm looking at collard greens, I'm looking at green beans, and I'm looking at black eyed peas. To me, that's Appalachian cuisine. But if you're looking at it, you might say, "Well, Sandy, we eat green beans here too. We eat collard beans as well." So it's interesting how we label things, but again, do we own this type of culture of food, or is it global, or did we inherit it? I will say too that forage foods like they're called pawpaws. You might have heard of them. There are mushrooms and something called ramps, and we'll talk a little bit about ramps in just a minute. Those are things that you find in the forest. And think about if you're an immigrant and you were coming to Appalachia, you were pretty much living off the land. That's all you had. You didn't have the grocery store around the corner. You didn't have the coffee shop around the corner. So you're pretty much going into the forest and looking to see what you had, along with the rivers and the mountains to get your food. Cornbread is a staple with Appalachia. You will find that there's a little bit of controversy with cornbread. So if you're from northern Appalachia, you have a much different cornbread than you do in the South. In the South, you have a cornbread that's a little crumbly, not dry, but a little dry. If you're in this north, you have a very moist cornbread that is super sweet. You'd think that would be opposite, but it's not. So the North has this little bit sweeter cornbread, and it's pretty much a controversy. When you start to get to the middle of Appalachia, you can see that controversy. Well, what's your cornbread like when you go to a restaurant? And if they tell you it's sweet, if you're from the South, you probably are not going to eat the cornbread. What are you going to do? You're going to go for the biscuit. So the cornbread is up and down throughout Appalachia, but it's a little different tasting where you're at. The canning, as I said, my grandmother would put up so much food in her garden. She tilled it and worked it and weeded it every single day. That was a way to survive if you didn't make a lot of money. And this was back in the early 70s. Then and the grocery store was really far, and she lived actually on a mountain, so she would have to walk down the mountain. She could not drive to get to a grocery store. Wasn't always convenient, so she had to farm, and everybody around her had a farm. When I was growing up, if somebody didn't have a farm, they were odd. And when I say a farm, it could be just a patch, or it could be their entire backyard, which could be a patch, or it could be acres. And they would utilize that land and they would cultivate it. And they would end up canning their fruits, their vegetables, sometimes canned meats. Meat was not always something easy to come by. So a lot of times, I will say that my ancestors made venison jerky, and that was a huge hit with my family. Pickling is another way. And again, remember I mentioned that the Native Americans brought that pickling idea in with the vinegar, so we can preserve our foods a little bit more. And by understanding the traditions and ingredients, we can trace the spices and the heritage of our foods from Appalachia. There is a handout that I gave, and one of the items on the handout is called a vinegar pie. that came from a small Swiss community that's around the corner from where my mother actually was born and raised. It how this was made in the mountains, there's not a lot of roads in there, there's no grocery stores around. They have to travel at least 30 minutes, probably closer to an hour to a grocery store and a gas station. But this small community kept their traditions alive, and the vinegar pie recipe comes directly from them. Something as well that my grandmother made, and it was a part of the reason that she made some of the foods that she did is because supplies. If they had to go to a store to buy supplies or buy eggs, if they didn't have a chicken that was laying or something like that, that was expensive. That was not something that was done. I remember my grandfather talking about how he had to barter for a hog. He was a carpenter, so he would build things so he could feed his family and barter for meat as he was going through the winter months. So if you think about it, all cultures really are similar in their techniques, their flavors, their ways to preserve, but they're also unique in the fact that they're just feeding their family and they're experiencing their own culture and heritage that they grew up with and passing it down. And then, does Appalachian food relate to all cultures? So this is kind of the next question that I'm going to ask you guys is you are looking at this. Does the cabbage, the cured meat, the tomato, or the potato occur in your own culture? Now, if you're Appalachian, I'm pretty sure you're going to say yes, it does. And for example, cabbage, we live by cabbage. Fried cabbage and potatoes is definitely a thing that we got from the Irish. The cured meats, well, the Greeks and the Romans refined dry curing techniques to meats, but they carried it on throughout the years. And then when the immigrants from Europe came over to Appalachia, that's how we learned how to cure our meats. We brought that tradition with us. That is actually, for those of you that are around the West Virginia, more the West Virginia, the Maryland, the Pennsylvania parts of Appalachia, that meal is extremely popular for breakfast, and since it's my breakfast hour right now, that's probably something I'm gonna have as soon as this presentation is over. It's called cream chip beef over fried potatoes, and that's just something that I grew up with. Tomatoes. I can tell you that tomatoes is a huge part of my life. I originally took a DNA test because I was convinced I was Italian, and you'll laugh at this. I was loved pizza, loved spaghetti so much, everything to do with Italian food. I figured, well, I must be Italian because it's got to be in my DNA. As I mentioned, I have no Italian DNA, but I do love Italian food and I do love tomato. The interesting thing to mention about that, though, is in West Virginia, it has a large contingent of Italians because they came over to work the mines. And one of the things that they created and they brought were pepperoni rolls. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second as well. I love a pepperoni roll in South Georgia, or excuse me, North Georgia. I have to make them myself. It's laborious. It's not something that I enjoy when making when I could just go to the store and buy them. And then potatoes. Potatoes is one of the most widely consumed food groups globally. At first, this surprised me, and then I remembered French fries. So that's probably part of the reason. And since I did mention tomatoes, I will just tell you that where I grew up, and especially here in the South, I've got my gratuitous tomato sandwich picture, and this also brings up a lot of controversy. If you know anything about a tomato sandwich, you're probably going to have it on good old Wonder Bread and mayonnaise. Where's the controversy? Well, the controversy is going to be in your mayonnaise. So this is going to be a modern Appalachia culture discussion, I'll say. And it's pretty much an argument. What is your favorite mayonnaise? And do you, heaven forbid, do you use that thing, that other product that is not mayonnaise? Has the word whip in it. So a tomato sandwich in Appalachia is heaven. It's just heaven, and if you're growing these tomatoes yourself, it's even better. All we do usually is we slice the tomatoes, put salt and pepper on it, slap a whole bunch of mayonnaise on it between 2 plain pieces of white bread, not toasted, not anything like that, and this is pure heaven. This is what I grew up with. This is what I had for lunch. So let's talk then a little bit about the foods I grew up with. And I know that some of you talked about ramps. If you know ramps, then you know ramps. There's no way getting around it. A couple funny stories that I have to share with ramps. These are actually something that is foraged. Ramps, you got to be very, very careful with because it takes many years for them to grow back. So you've got to be careful how you harvest them. They look innocent enough. They look similar to a leek, and if you've ever had a leek before, leek is really kind of a mild onion. These are not mild. If you have ramps, then chances are you're gonna have ramps with you for at least the next month. If you dare to cook them in your house, you're gonna have ramps with you in your house for probably the next 6 months. It's something that just does not go away. It is similar to garlic more than onion, and the culture and the heritage with ramps is unbelievable in Appalachia. Why? Every April, if you look anywhere around the news, the local news, anywhere in mostly central Appalachia, not so much northern and not so much southern, you will see ramp dinners. Churches will have ramp dinners, communities will have ramp dinners. The firehouse will have ramp dinners. Just random restaurants will have ramp dinners. Ramps have even found their way into James Beard winning restaurants, and they classify it as a specialty or a delicacy when it gets into those restaurants. And I can tell you right now, my mother will tell you there is nothing special about it, and there's not a delicacy. The ramps were banned from our house. She didn't want any more of them. She had enough of them as a child. She didn't like the smell. She didn't like the fact that the smell came out of your pores for 30 days. She didn't like anything to do with that. But my uncle does have an annual ramp dinner, and he has in his community about 200 people that come to it. The ramps, how to cook them, is also in the handout. And I will tell you that in a nutshell, you want to boil the ramps outside. Do not boil or cook the ramps initially inside, or else that smell will stay in your house forever. So you want to cook them outside. Once they're cooked, you want to bring them inside, and you're gonna pretty much, I call it sliver potatoes. You're gonna fry both of them together, and then you're gonna enjoy it, usually with cornbread. And I will tell you, you either love or hate ramps. There's no in between with that. Oh, let me go back. I'm sorry, let me go back. I did forget to talk. I am curious about dumplings with you guys. If you notice, this is chicken and dumplings. This is potted chicken and dumplings. It's kind of hard to see. Our chicken and dumplings are made with a flour Bisquick, and they're the big fluffy kind. But if you're up north and if you're in the extreme south, you're making the flat rolled out dumplings with instead of the big fluffy kind. Pretty much the reason why, so I'd say central, Appalachia did the big fluffy kind is that's the way that the immigrants showed us. We did not have a lot of tools. We just would put things together with our hands. That was always a big deal in the kitchen, that you used your hands and pop them in the broth. Sitting there, making the dough, rolling the dough out, cutting the dough, that was just something that a large family didn't have time to do. But they could get into the bowl and they could make the dumplings and then pop them into a large pot. It This was a way to save a little bit of money. If you notice, if most chicken and dumplings, it's a lot of broth, it's a lot of dumplings, and very little pieces of chicken, and it was a way to save money and make meals stretch. And hot dogs. So this is one of my favorite things. I ask for this every year for my birthday, is a West Virginia slaw dog. Have no idea why it's a West Virginia slaw dog, but I can tell you I grew up with it. My dad grew up with it. It is what it is. What is a West Virginia slaw dog? It's pretty much a hot dog with chili, usually no bean chili, diced onions, and a whole bunch of slaw. If you're somewhere else, you might have, for example, a piece of lettuce and mustard and ketchup on your hot dog. Not really in Appalachia are we gonna have that, but this is a culture throughout the United States, and I was quite surprised at this, that where you go depends on what type of hot dog you're gonna have. So, I have a good friend in the project that I'm in, an Appalachia project that knows Chicago quite well. So an iconic, Chicago-style hot dog is made from an all beef sausage, but it has chopped white onion, sweet pickle, relish, tomato slices, pickled peppers. They never use ketchup apparently on their hot dogs in Chicago. So very different. But again, they're bringing in their culture, and Chicago has a tremendous amount of culture and heritage from their immigrants. And a sense of community. This one's kind of important to me because this is what I grew up with. If your community had any type of event, it could be a birthday, it could be a retirement, definitely an illness or a death, food always brought comfort. Food was always there during illness or death. You never asked for food. When somebody would pass away in my family, after you went to the funeral, you always went back mostly to the person's house, sometimes to the relative's house, sometimes it was whoever was closest to that particular church where the funeral was. And the amount of food at an Appalachian funeral is astounding, and the amount of people that are there also to honor the person is tremendous. And ladies have this all set up. They have almost assembly line. You don't have to do anything because they realize you're grieving, and they're trying to give you comfort, and they're trying to give you food. This church is actually my grandfather's church, and it was always brought me joy every summer when we would go to the little picnic area there and meet up with his family, and there would be a family reunion. People would bring their lawn chairs. I don't know if you remember those yard chairs with the webbing kind of as a seat. And whenever us kids would get bored, right behind to the right of that little picnic area was the cemetery. And this is probably feeding into my love of genealogy. When we would get bored, my grandfather would say, "Go find, Sally Cutright, and she's buried up there, but I'm not going to tell you where." So it became almost a heritage hunt, and then we would have to come back and tell him the dates that were on the tombstone. So this was something that we did just for a family reunion or church reunion. And I want to mention real quick, we're running out of time, but I want to mention really quick about the coal wars. The coal wars of West Virginia brought all types of immigrants, Hungarians, Slavic, Germans, Italians, African Americans. This is how Appalachia became a community and friends. And I have my coal bucket here. And inside my coal bucket, this is what coal miners would do. They had, let me pull it out, they had two sections. And in the top section, they would have any baked goods. So a pepperoni roll, and I have a piece of sweet potato pie. And then in the bottom section, and usually these would have three sections, with the bottom being water. But then in the bottom section, I have a whole bunch of fried chicken. This is what coal miners would bring with them and eat. They had to be secure because when you're down in the mines, there are rats. So they had to be secured, and they had to make sure that they did not get your food, because you're down in the mines. You cannot get back up very quickly and easily, and you had to eat. And a lot of times they were going to fight for your food. So you had to make sure that you kept your food safe. And I just want to finish up as we go through the slides that food does have a meaning for us to bring people together. It is something that is common, whether a family is agreeing or disagreeing, they can almost always meet at a dinner table, and they can almost always have a discussion. Sunday suppers were a very big thing with my family. And we talked a little bit about the traditional dishes, the fried apple pies. How many of you have had a fried hand pie? That's pretty much what we're talking about. Pinto beans with cornbread, that's a meal. Add in an onion. I like the green spring onions, then that's definitely a meal that you had. They did live off the land, deer, squirrel, those are stew meats. If you were extremely poor, you were going to probably have squirrel. That was just something that you had. The pepperoni rolls, which I showed, and here's the pepperoni roll. They were actually created by the Italian American coal miners in West Virginia for a snack as they were down in the coal mines. And I just want to mention too that old ways are new again. So if you've ever had an almanac or ever looked at an almanac, those are making a comeback to tell us what's going on, to predict. Planting by the signs, that's the calendar in the middle. That calendar, I believe, is from 1957, but you can still buy these at the feed store today. You can buy them online, you can buy them on Amazon. And I actually do a year-long show where each month we show you when to plant and when not to plant. And this is based on a culture from my ancestors that brought this tradition all the way over from Ireland. So this is kind of interesting. And then the other thing that I want to point out is ginseng. So as you know, sometimes Appalachia areas are poverty. They do have some areas where jobs need to be brought in. But foraging ginseng in West Virginia brought in about $2 million in the year 2000. That is huge for West Virginia. That's a lot of money, and that's usually people like you or me going out and foraging and bringing those in. So Appalachia food truly is just like Appalachia. Once you have it, you're gonna love it. And I can tell you that these photos are actually my photos. These are foods that we make in my family or made. The top left is strawberries. Strawberries is a very big crop. My dad was chief of police in one town in West Virginia where they have the strawberry festival every year. It's a very big crop in that town. This middle one, and I want to do a little shout out to our friend Mags, is boiled peanuts, one of her favorite things. And she's from Appalachia, she's from Southern Appalachia. The next one is, of course, the biscuit, but the biscuit is a skillet biscuit, and the gravy is a coal gravy. And that's also in the handout how to make that. In onions, tomatoes, and unfortunately, something that I don't care for is scrapple. Scrapple is more in the central and northern parts of Appalachia. Again, once you make that in your house, it will stay in your house all day. That smell, you won't get rid of it. We also have our own types of soda. Some people call them pop. One of my favorites is cheerwine. And I know that I said that this is more than moonshine, but we do have moonshine and we do drink it. I'm not going to sit here and deny that to you. The last thing I want to do is I would be really remiss if I didn't mention that the mudslides that happened recently due to Helene has left my dear Appalachians in North Carolina, some in Georgia, some in South Carolina, and some in Tennessee into a point of food insecurity. And no family deserves to have food insecurity. Food insecurity is a US government term, and it's when people don't have enough to eat and don't know where their next meal is gonna come from. A lot of people have lost their homes, and it's gonna take a while to recover. I encourage everybody to reach out in any way that you can or feel like doing, but also to visit Appalachia and visit these areas that are now open. They're gonna need your income, your tourist dollars, and I guarantee you, you're gonna find a really, really good meal as you go along. And the last thing that I wanna leave you guys with, I have, a special little mention from my mother-in-law and my mother about their favorite foods as they grew up in Appalachia. So let me play that for you, and I'll see you on the other side of this cute video.
As a young girl growing up in the mountains of Virginia, back in the Appalachian Mountains, Buchanan County, one of my very favorite foods was egg butter. My mother made it from scratch, and I think she usually made it on Sunday mornings. and she would serve it on hot homemade biscuits with butter that we had churned, and it was delicious. And I have never made it myself, but it's delicious.
My mother always made soup beans and baked potatoes. She called them baked potatoes, but they were actually potatoes that were boiled and then fried. Made them with beans and macaroni, and that's what we eat. We had it almost every day. Yeah. And for dessert, sometimes we would have chocolate cake, but that wasn't very often because it didn't last that long. The cake was gone. We also had lemon pie every now and then.
And that is from my mother-in-law and my mother, and they lived similar. They lived in similar places. My mother-in-law lived in Tazewell, Virginia, down at the bottom towards Kentucky, and my mother lived literally on top of a mountain. She would mention that it would snow in July. She had to get off the mountain. They were poor. They lived off the land, and when she mentions that they would sometimes have chocolate cake, but that was rare, it was because that was a luxury item, and unfortunately, you can't see it, but I did make a chocolate cake for my mom, and the smell of chocolate is really, um, very pungent in my studio, but I made a chocolate cake for my mom to enjoy later on today since she mentioned it, and they lived off the land. There was no, fast food or anything like that for them, and to this day, some of the foods that they still like are the simple foods that they grew up on. And I hope that you think about this today about the foods that you grew up on and what is your favorites. And I hope you found that there's some Appalachian foods that maybe are in your culture as well. Let me go ahead and take a couple questions. I think we had a few questions before we end up. So, what is the one missing county in the whole in the blue region? So, let me bring that up. And, Joker, if the one missing hole in the Blue County, there's a couple of them. So I think you mean that one. And I can tell you, I'm not sure what the county is. I know that if we had Dee from the Appalachia Project, she'd be able to tell me instantly because she's our expert on Mississippi. But I can tell you that some counties did not want to be part of Appalachia. And that's probably what happened there. If you notice over here in the orangey peachy color, there's a big chunk out there from Virginia. That's the Shenandoah Valley. And they did not want to be part of what the US federal government designated as Appalachia. It was political reasons, and they did not receive any funds from the government, and sometimes that ended up hurting them more. I have some people that prefer not to be called Appalachian. They find that as a negative, and they would prefer that we not identify them or their county as Appalachian. But again, this is our source from the federal government. My guess is that county decided they just didn't want to be a part of it. And then, does geography play a role in the use of pork? Does it take lots of flat land to raise cattle? Tabor, I'm so glad that you answered this, and I really wish my mom, I know she's watching, and I wish she was in the chat. Her grandfather, her beloved grandfather, my beloved Bonners, living up on Point Mountain, actually had cattle. So I think that when there was a will, there is a way to have animals. I can tell you that my other grandmother lived on a very, very, very steep hill, and they had a lot of chickens as well. And the chickens would sometimes a little bit tumble and have to find their feet because the hill was so steep going up. And what is scrapple? Well, Anne, it is hard to describe what scrapple truly is. The only thing I can tell you is it's all the leftover parts of usually a pig. And when you cook it, it smells. I have banned scrapple from my house. Anytime I have a business trip or away from home, my husband always makes it for himself because he can. But otherwise, it's just something that's terrible stinky. I don't know how he eats it. And I will show you his comment now. So I don't know why he likes it at all. But, uh, To each his own. I guess that's the best thing to say. And Christine, thank you for this comment. I don't have an ounce of Appalachia in my ancestry, but my father-in-law was from Avery County, North Carolina. My husband has cousins down there, and we visit quite a few times, and it's very, very dear to me. And I got to tell you, as you can tell from my enthusiasm and my love of Appalachia, it is extremely dear to me. It's where I've spent most of my history. I have given up a large part of my professional genealogy business to focus and be an advocate for Appalachia and Appalachians. So I appreciate you guys being here today. I hope that you made you a little hungry, and if you have a chance, biscuits. There's not a biscuit recipe in the handout. Biscuits are not the easiest thing in the world to make if you don't have patience. That's the best way that my grandmother said it. And thank you for joining me. And I hope you explore Appalachia in your next travels, your next vacation, or come and join us in Appalachia Project here on WikiTree. Bye, everybody. Enjoy the second day of the symposium.